Please be seated. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, would you just give us your full name for the record, please?
This is David William Brown.
And do you wish to affirm or swear an oath?
Affirm, please.
Okay, well, I'll just repeat the words after me. I, David Brown,
I, David Brown,
sincerely declare and affirm
sincerely declare and affirm
that the evidence that I give to this commission
that the evidence that I give to this Commission
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Now, Mr. Davis.
May it please the Commission. Mr. Brown, you've prepared a witness statement for the purpose of this hearing, have you not?
Yes, I have.
Could I ask the operator to put up document CRW 998 002 0001? Does that come up on a screen that you can see, Mr. Brown?
Yes, I can do that on the screen.
Thank you. Is that your statement dated 26th of July 2021?
Yes, it is.
Could we turn to page 0022? Now on the screen it might be blocked out, but if you have a copy with you, or can you confirm that you signed the statement on 26th?
Yes, I did sign. Yes, I did.
Thank you. And on the next page, 23, those are documents which you've referred to or were referred to you for the purpose of providing your statement, aren't they?
Yes, they were.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, can you confirm the contents of your witness statement are true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. Commissioner, I tender that statement. That's the evidence in chief.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. The witness statement of David Brown, dated the 26th of July 2021 and bearing the identifier number CRW.998.002.0001 is admitted into evidence as an exhibit. Thank you, Ms. Cale.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Brown,
Yes.
can I begin by gaining a better understanding of the operations at the main cage at Perth Casino and your role as the General Manager of Cage and Count at Crown Perth? Now, while you held that position between 2006 and 2020, I'm going to ask you to answer my questions in this first section of your examination by reference to the period between 2013 and 2015, unless I specifically ask otherwise. So do you understand what I'm asking of you?
Yes.
Do you agree that the primary function of the main cage at the Perth Casino is to process financial transactions for the purposes of gaming and to record those financial transactions?
Yes, we also do some non-gaming, but the majority of the work is for gaming, yes.
And do you agree that the cage's responsibility in processing and recording those financial transactions is to do so accurately
Yes.
and in accordance with any legal requirements
Yes.
and in accordance with the systems, policies and procedures of Crown Perth?
Correct, yes.
And that was the function and those were the responsibilities of the main cage between 2013 and 2015
Yes.
and has always been the function and responsibilities of the main cage
Yes.
and remains the functions and responsibilities of the main cage.
Yes.
Do you agree that the main cage operations are essentially process driven?
I believe, yes, they are. Yes.
And in that the processing and recording of transactions is heavily dependent upon cage staff following written standard procedures and policies,
Yes.
and also having clearly defined authority limits for approving the processing of transactions.
Yes.
And the main way in which the standard procedures and policies and approval limits are followed is by creating a series of documented procedures entitled Standard Operating Procedures, or SOPs.
Yes.
And cage staff are required to follow those SOPs,
Yes, they are.
and you are required to follow those SOPs.
Yes.
Can I ask you about the hours of operation of the main cage? Now, the casino was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, wasn't it?
Yes.
And so did the main cage also operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week?
When we talk main cage, though, are we talking? There's numerous cages on the Perth casino floor.
Yes.
So there's a main cage,
Yes.
a plaza cage, as it's termed, and a riverside cage.
Yeah.
Along with a cage in the Pearl Room.
I'm asking you about the main cage.
The main cage wasn't open 24/7, no.
So
the main cage generally during the week would close at 4 a.m. if my memory is correct, and open again at about 10 o'clock or midday, depending on operational. And then it would, on a weekend, it would open longer. I can't remember 12 months ago whether it was 24/7 on the weekend, but I think it was very close to 24/7 on the weekend, yes.
and how many shifts per weekday would operate in the main cage?
In the main cage, cashiers would range from 2 in the morning through to 3 or 4 in the afternoon, maybe 5 on a night time on the front window, plus a chip bank and a main bank. And there would always be a member of management in the main cage to oversee the operation of the main cage.
How many shifts per weekday would operate in the main cage?
Not really sure. 8 to 10 on a day. Main bank did 2, chip bank 3, and the front window there might have been 2, 3, maybe up to 10 shifts on the front window. So
10 shifts per day or 10 shifts per week?
no, per day. So you'd have 2 starting on day shift, and then probably 3 in the afternoon, and maybe 4 on night. So 9 to 10, depending on what day of the week in the main cage on the front window.
So let's talk about the front window. How many cashiers were stationed at the front window at any one time?
In the maximum, there was probably 5 at any one time on a busy day.
And those up to 5 staff members would be rostered on for a shift?
Yes, either 8 or 10 hours, yes.
Right. So how many shifts per day? Was it 2 per day, per weekday?
Well, it would depend. It would depend on, because they would stagger. So the morning shift would generally be replaced by the night shift, and then there would be a middle shift that would work in between those two. So potentially there could be, without looking back at the roster, there could be anywhere from 2 in the morning moving up to 4 or 5 in the middle of the day, and then 5 at night shift. So it could be up to 10 at a time on a day rostered in the main cage on the front window.
All right. If we go to paragraph 11 of your witness statement at page 0002, you describe the employees who work within the main cage. Is the description that you give in that paragraph accurate with respect to how the cage operated between 2013 and 2015?
I think though sorry, which paragraph we're looking at?
11 at page 0002.
Okay. I can't see where I've got a number for in page 11 in the cage, because it's not talking main cage, it's talking, in the witness statement, it's talking cage, not main cage. So my reference to the numbers of 3 to 6 supervisors and 12 to 14 cashiers would be spread across all our cages.
All right. And so with respect to the main cage, just in terms of the type of role rather than the number, so you've got cashiers, supervisors and shift managers.
Yep.
Is the evidence you've given here applicable to how the main cage operated between 2013 and 2015?
I believe so, yes.
And if we go to paragraph 12 at page 0003.
Yep.
That was the situation that applied in relation to the main cage or all of the cages?
No, when I talk cage, I don't just talk main cage, I talk all of the cages.
All right. But that was the position that applied or pertained between 2013 and 2015?
I believe so, yes.
And when we're talking about the staff in the main cage or who were allocated to the main cage, did they perform all of their work physically in the main cage itself?
No, it would depend. I mean, the cage itself would move staff around. So when you were rostered, a cashier may be rostered in the main cage for the shifts, and they would generally spend their whole shift located in the main cage. If they're rostered in the chip bank, they would be in the chip bank. If they're rostered in the main bank, they would be in the main bank for the whole shift. But the management would move around from cage to cage as required for operational requirements. And if somebody was rostered in the main cage and there was a sick day, or it was busier in one of the other cages, or a break need to be covered, or something went on, they may be moved from the main cage to one of the other cages as well. So a cashier could end up working in any cage, the same as a supervisor, and the shift managers would move around between the cages.
Right.
So generally, the only two that would generally stay in the one location or in the main cage for the shift would be a chip bank cashier and a main bank cashier.
And so in cage management, the people who you describe who move around between cages, that includes supervisors, does it?
Yes, cage supervisors and cage shift manager, yes.
Now, between paragraphs 14 and 35 of your witness statement, that's at pages 003 to 005, you describe the kinds of transactions that occur at the cage.
Yes.
Does that evidence accurately describe the type and details of transactions handled by the main cage between 2013 and 2015?
I believe it does. It talks there about gaming tickets. I can't remember when gaming tickets came into effect at Crown Perth, an actual date. So that may not have been the gaming machine tickets. It may have been more the manual gaming. I can't remember the exact date for that. Sorry.
All right.
But it's still a function of cashing out gaming machine winnings, whether it was tickets or handwritten payments.
Right, coming back to paragraph 11, please, at page 0002, you describe there the responsibilities of the different staffing positions within the cage, and you commence at little a with a description of the cage cashiers.
Yep.
Were cage cashiers required to have any particular qualifications or experience to hold that position?
No, not effectively. No, there's no qualifications to become a cage cashier. It's an area where we bring people in, we give them some training and give them some skills, and they perform the role. But there's no formal qualifications to be a cage cashier. No.
Now, I understand from what you say here in little a that cashiers could not process transactions over $10,000. Was that for AML compliance reasons?
Yes.
So, do I understand correctly, a cashier could process any transaction under $10,000 without the involvement of any supervisor or manager?
Correct. So they could perform. It depended on how long they'd been there. So there are some levels set for newer cashiers with lower levels, but once any transaction reached 10,000, whether they're an experienced cashier or an inexperienced cashier, they must have called a member of cage management over to assist with the transaction, to help with the verification of the patron and to make sure that they completed their AML threshold transaction reporting.
For the transactions under $10,000 that didn't require the direct involvement of a supervisor or manager, were
Yes.
those transactions nevertheless checked, either in every case or from time to time by a supervisor or manager?
Yes, from time to time, not in every case. So there wasn't a requirement for management to check every transaction under 10, but there was management rostered at the cages to be able to assist and view and monitor and assist the cashiers in performing their duties, yes.
So if you can tell me about the monitoring, please, when assistance hasn't been sought or provided to a cashier, what was the monitoring function, who carried it out and how?
Okay, the supervisors would be stationed out the front area of the cage, and they would be there to assist and the cashiers and watch what was going on with the patrons while the cashiers were serving patrons, and they would assist cashiers as they were called over to do so once they had reached a certain threshold level for transactions. So they were, the supervisors were there to watch what was going on.
Did supervisors, after paperwork was processed, review that paperwork from time to time?
They would review the next day. There was some reporting done the next day. Would they review it after they'd completed it? Probably not. If they had signed off on it, agreeing to it at the time, I don't believe that they would then go back and review it again later on for the transaction that they completed.
Right. So I'm talking about transactions under $10,000 that didn't require their involvement. Would they ever, after the event, look at the paperwork that had been prepared and processed by a cashier to check that it was correct?
They would, if they felt they needed to, they were in a position where they could do that, yes.
Right. But there was no standard requirement for them to do that?
No.
Apart from approving transactions or assisting with transactions over $10,000 and overseeing the work of the cashiers in the way in which you've described for transactions under $10,000, did the supervisors have any other responsibilities?
No, their job was to supervise the area that they were located in. They had different responsibilities depending on which cage they would be located in and what time of the day and night. So there were reports that had to be run around the banking of checks, documentation at night. There was preparation of banking processes for the next day. So there would be functions they were required to perform depending on which cage they were located in. If they were located over in the plaza cage, there was less reporting functions because the main bank and the chip banks weren't there. If they were located in the Pearl Room, they were dealing with more of the VIP patrons. So there was some reporting they needed to do there in regards to the threshold transaction reporting and checking it the next day before it was sent off to AML.
Were supervisors required to have any particular qualifications or experience to hold the position they did, apart from having previously worked as a cashier?
No, but every cage supervisor in Perth has started in the cage as a cage cashier and then worked their way up as a cashier after a period of time and through performance moved up to the role of cage supervisor.
And then some of them moved up after the supervisor role to a shift manager role, didn't they?
Correct. In the same way that every cage cashier, every cage supervisor has worked as a cashier, every cage shift manager has also worked as a cage cashier.
And does that mean, therefore, that shift managers did not require any particular qualifications or experience apart from having worked as a cashier and supervisor to work as a shift manager?
Correct, yes.
Now, was there a distinction between the manager of the cage and count and the shift managers?
The manager, there was, I don't think there was a time when there was a cage manager.
All right, thank you.
So I was general manager of the cage and the shift managers reported to me.
And the shift managers all reported directly to you?
Correct, yes.
And what was the role and responsibilities of the shift managers when compared to the supervisors?
So the supervisors were responsible for supervising the area that they were worked in. The shift managers then were the overseers of the day-to-day operation of the cage. So it would be their responsibility for assigning the staff to the areas that they wanted them to work in. It was their job to make sure that the shifts were running in accordance with how they would expect them to run, to make sure that there was sufficient staff on shift to meet the requirements of the shifts. And they're also responsible for ensuring that the transfers into the bank accounts were completed effectively.
Were they responsible on their shift for satisfying themselves that the transactions were being processed accurately and in accordance with the cage's standard procedures?
I think that, I think probably that's a difficult one. I mean, there's a lot of transactions performed at the cage. The staff are accountable for those transactions and accountable for their balancing processes. To say that a shift manager, when there's one on each shift, is responsible for every transaction that occurred on every shift is probably tough. But they are overall responsible for checking that transactions are done and reporting if there's any errors that have come their way that they've been informed of. But I don't think they're responsible for checking every transaction on every shift, no.
Did they routinely check the work of the cashiers on during the course of a shift?
I wouldn't have thought they were ad hoc checking the work on a shift. I mean, the cage generally works. We've got surveillance overseeing what the operations of the staff are doing. They're completing transactions the staff have to balance. So they're probably more checking when there's errors, more so than checking ad hoc if things aren't going bad.
In the last sentence of little c in paragraph 11 that you should have on the screen, it says, you say the shift manager has the overall approval authority for cage transactions whilst on the shift. What do you mean by that?
Oh, if something went wrong or something, they were in charge of the shifts. So they were responsible if there was anything that needed to be escalated or anything that was questioned or challenged, then it was their responsibility to make the final call of what was going on their shifts.
Was there any approval limit that a shift manager had that a cage supervisor did not have?
Not really, no. Not that I'm aware of at this stage, no.
Now, I think in answer to some of my earlier questions, you mentioned that the setup, if you will, was slightly different for the satellite cages from the main cage.
A little bit. I mean, there's no chip bank and main bank in the satellite cages, but the role of a front window cashier in the plaza cage, as it's termed, in the main cage, is very, very similar. In that it's performing all functions. The role of the cashier in the Riverside cage is a little bit different in that it's mainly a gaming machine area, so they're performing more functions in regards to gaming machines.
Was a cage supervisor or one or more cage supervisors stationed at each satellite cage during a shift?
No, not always. No.
And each of the satellite cages applied the same procedures and processes for processing transactions as
Yes.
the main cage?
Yes.
Were there any transactions that could only be processed or recorded by the main cage and could not be processed or recorded by a satellite cage?
No, not that I'm aware of, no.
Now, coming to your role as General Manager, you explain at paragraph 5 of your witness statement that prior to being employed by Crown, you worked for the State Bank of Victoria for 9.5 years in a managerial role. What was that?
It varied as I moved through the bank. So I started in the bank in a housing loans area and then moved into a leasing and asset finance area and then moved into a different area of business banking information system, and from there finally as the loans manager or loan support manager, I think it was, at the Commonwealth Bank 367 Collins Street. So,
do you have any tertiary academic qualifications?
no, I don't.
As General Manager of the Cage and Count at Crown Perth, did you have regular hours of work?
I did have regular hours of work because of meetings and that, but I worked as the job required me to work. So I generally would work 9 to 5-ish. So, I would start generally at 8 in the morning, finish about 6:30 at night, most days. And then if we had busy weekends, be it Chinese New Year, Easter, other events, I would work as required. So.
And when you were performing your regular hours of work, did you work physically and mainly in the main cage?
I have an office, or had an office in the main cage, so out the back of the main cage, but I had to go into the main cage to get to my office, yes.
But did you basically locate yourself there most of the time during your hours of work?
Yeah, so I would probably be there a majority of the time, but I did, attend a lot of meetings, and I did spend time in pretty much all the cages on a regular basis, so yeah.
Can I just ask you to have a look at this document, CRW.529.001.8915. This is an email chain, and if we go to the second half of the page, there's an email from you to Mr. Hancock of the 23rd of October 2014. The content's not really that material for the purposes of my question if we go over the page at 8916. We look at the footer. If we can just blow that up. You say at the bottom, due to the nature of my work, I'm not always at my desk and only check my emails 2 to 3 times per day. What was...
I wonder if the personal details, including the mobile phone number, could be blank from screen.
Do you see there you said
Yes, I do.
only check your emails 2 to 3 times per day? What was that about?
Yeah, I'm not really sure why that was on there, but it certainly wasn't the case. I was available more times, and obviously if we're talking, right throughout my time, I mean, we have a work mobile phone, which is receiving your emails, and I'm constantly doing it. I think it was just generally more to say, if you want something and you need me, you should contact me, because it's more likely, if it's urgent, that I will respond to a phone call than if you send an email. So if I was busy in meetings, or if I'm busy with customers, or I'm busy dealing with staff, I may not be checking emails, but I'll certainly be available on my phone.
How much interaction did you have with cage cashiers in your role as General Manager?
I knew all the cashiers. I would spend time in each of the locations as time permitted throughout my day. I have a solid relationship with the cashiers, and certainly I was involved with the day-to-day operation of the cage from that perspective.
What about the supervisors? You had daily interaction with them?
Yeah, so when they were on shift, yes, I would have had daily interaction with the supervisors.
And the shift managers?
Certainly I had daily interaction with the shift managers, yes.
And you talked a moment ago about being available to work outside regular hours at busy periods. Separately from that, were you required to be on call or available to be contacted by cage staff outside normal working hours?
I suppose the question is required. There's an expectation in your contract to work additional hours and hours as required for the role. So therefore, having a work mobile, I was contacted at any time of the day and night, depending on as situations arose, yes.
And what's the sort of situation, if you can just give me an example, that would cause you to be contacted any time of the day or night?
Just if there was something the staff weren't quite sure about, or if there was an issue that they thought that needed escalation, or they weren't sure what to do, or if they couldn't get hold of someone, they would contact me. If there'd been a large error that they thought I might need to know about, if there was generally just something they weren't sure about, they would contact me.
And did you have to meet certain KPIs in your position as General Manager Cage and Count?
We were reviewed on an annual basis for our performance, yes. So,
Did you have to meet certain KPIs in your role as General Manager of Cage and Count?
The KPIs were part of the performance review process.
What were those KPIs?
They were a range of KPIs, and I can't remember off the top because they varied on a yearly basis and would be different, but they were around customer service, compliance, budgeting. I'm not quite sure of all the other ones. There's a range of them, and they have a different level of weighting effectively. But without saying it, I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Can you remember the general type of KPI that was related to customer service compliance?
No, it was ensuring that we were following our processes, ensuring that we were servicing our customers and servicing within the requirements of the role, making sure that we're being compliant.
So compliance with policies and procedures was an element of your KPIs, as you recall?
Yes.
In terms of your responsibilities as General Manager, Cage and Count at Perth Casino, would you agree that you bore the overall responsibility to ensure the satisfactory performance of the main cage's function?
No, I think my role at Crown in the role of GM was to oversee the Cage and Count, just the main cage function. So it was Cage and Count, so it includes the count team there, but it's over 100 staff, and it was making sure that we were meeting the requirements as required, and we had staff then working under me who were then performing their roles. So it was ensuring that the cage was running efficiently within the budgets required, and working to ensure the staff were performing their roles effectively. Yes.
And in relation to that last point, and in respect of the cage operation, it was your overall responsibility to ensure that transactions were recorded in accordance with the procedures and policies of Crown Perth.
Yeah, I suppose as the general manager and as the head of anything, it was the staff are responsible for completing transactions, and the same as I said with the shift managers, I can't expect them to oversee every transaction. I wasn't in a position to oversee 100 staff and oversee every transaction that's being completed by the staff.
Did you have? Sorry.
Had you finished the answer?
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry, Mr. Brown, it's just a bit hard with the video link. It's not clear when you've finished. Apologise for that. Did you have primary responsibility for establishing the standard procedures for the cage? As the cage standard operating procedures, and me being the head of the cage, then I would say that yes, I was the person who signed off on or not signed off because they weren't signed off, but needed to make sure that they were in line with what we were doing, yes. And you amended those procedures when appropriate to do so? I did, or the staff under me did, yes. But you were responsible for making sure that they were amended when it was appropriate to amend them? Yes. And did you have primary responsibility for the contents of that part of the casino manual relevant to the operations of the main cage? That was more in consultation with our legal team. So I couldn't change those and submit them for change to the legal team. So if the main cage controls needed to be changed, they needed to be approved, or the main bank controls, as they were termed, needed to be changed. They needed to be approved by the department. So they would be done in consultation with our legal team, who would then submit them for review with the department. But you certainly contributed to the, technical component of the casino manual when technical input was required about cage operations. Yeah, I would, and some of my team would assist in that at yes. Were there any transactions in the cage that only you could approve? In other words, that could not be approved by a shift manager? No. In around August 2014, you recall that you commenced reporting to Mr. Preston as the Executive General Manager of Legal and Corporate Services. Yeah, I'm not quite sure of the date and time when I started reporting to Mr. Preston, but I did, as in my statement, report to Mr. Preston for a period of time, yes. Now, if we go to CRW.707.001.0354, this is a letter dated a few years later to GWC from Mr. Hume.
Yeah.
And what it's doing is actually explaining that the reporting structure will be reversed back to where it was before, where you then revert to reporting back to the CFO. And it attaches a modified description of the job descriptions for each of the CFO Australian Resorts and General Manager Cage and Count for Perth. You see that refers to attachment 2. If we go to 03660, and we look at the position summary box, you'll see that there's it's got you in that first line reporting to the CFO.
Yep.
Now, you received this document yesterday, I think, for review.
Yes, I did.
And are you able to say whether the job description, apart from that modification, accurately reflects your job description between 2013 and 2015?
I think isn't this last modified in 2017 according to this one? So I'm not sure if I looked at it to decide when I looked at the document to think whether it was accurate for 2013 to 2015.
Well, did anything stick out at you as, well, that was new, I didn't have to do that before 2017?
I probably didn't look at it for that point of view.
So I'll just ask you then a couple of questions. You see the first bullet point in the position summary, delivery of quality customer service to patrons at all levels.
Yep.
Was that always part of your job description?
I believe it was, yes.
How in practical terms did you achieve that in respect of cage operations?
Cage operations, it was ensuring that the customers weren't made to wait. Customers were provided with a good level of service, so we kept wait times to a minimum as best we could. We provided accurate transactions on the main floor, and then it dealt with dealing with, as it says, at all levels. So it dealt with dealing with our international room patrons, so whether that be local patrons in the international room, interstate, international, dealing with all patrons and making sure that we were looking after them from a cage perspective.
If we go to the fifth bullet point down, you see the one saying implementing business and strategic cage and count projects whilst maximising the customer service experience?
Yes.
That was in your job description at all times?
I'm not sure if that one was in there at all times. That doesn't seem something that I've seen a lot of before, but it's certainly in there at that time. But it talks about implementing, business and core. So it's about projects and about developing and looking at ways of improving our processes. So that might have been in there. I'm not sure when that went in there, no.
It seems to be talking about a balancing of implementing business and strategic projects whilst at the same time maximising the customer service experience. Is that how you understood the application of that requirement?
That's how I would read it, yes.
Now, the seventh bullet point talks about enhancing Crown Perth as the preferred destination for VIP gaming patrons. Was that always part of your job description?
Again, it doesn't, like the first one does. This one probably doesn't ring a bell as enhancing Crown Perth as a preferred destination. Seems to be a new one. But it's something, again, we were trying to be a destination where patrons wanted to come to, whether that was VIP patrons or whatever. So we were talking about, making sure we provided good service.
At the cage?
At the cage.
And that was the limit of it, on your understanding?
On my understanding, yes.
In the next box, if we can go there, please, it talks about key result areas. And over the page at 0361, if we can just blow up these second dot point. Let me just... Thank you. Under service focus, do you see the heading in the left-hand margin, service focus 25%?
Yep.
And if you move directly across, there's a bullet point that says negotiate contracts, etc. It's highlighted, can you see that?
Yes.
And then you drop down to the next bullet point, work with Crown Resorts Overseas Office Management to ensure that customer service expectations are met.
Yes.
Is that always part of your job description?
It was. I don't know. I think the job description was rewritten quite heavily at this stage, but I think it was always an expectation that we would work with our overseas office staff to ensure that we were providing service to our customers from overseas, yes.
And so what in practical terms did the cage have to do in that regard?
It was more about working with them to make sure that when the customers arrived that we provided that service level. So in regards to front money or check cashing facilities or funds advance facilities. So it was making sure that there was some processes in place and systems available or funds available when the patrons arrived.
Now at page 0362, you'll see lower down the page there's the operational management box.
Yep.
And the second bullet point says, ensure staff have the knowledge to complete junket and premium buy-ins and settlements for very, very important persons.
Yep.
That was part of your job description in 2013 to 2015?
Yeah, it was overseeing that and making sure that the staff were meeting their expectations in buy-ins and settlements for patrons, yes.
And that involved presumably ensuring that they had the knowledge to complete telegraphic transfers?
Yeah, that was part of the buy-in process or potentially the settlement process, yes.
And the fourth bullet point talks about approval of TT's bank checks and drafts. You see that?
Yep.
And that was obviously always part of your responsibilities?
Yeah, I didn't really approve TT's bank checks and drafts. So there was nothing, as we said, that I needed to approve, as we've already discussed, that the shift manager didn't need to approve. So there was nothing that my approval level that was above a shift manager from a TT's bank checks and drafts. So an approval of a TT could also be done by a shift manager, could also be done by a supervisor. So TT's bank checks and drafts wasn't, otherwise I would have had to be on site 24/7.
And you accept, though, that you did approve TTs from time to time?
On very rare occasions, I would do one, but I can't remember on many occasions, if we're talking 2013, 2015, doing many, no.
Well, when you say not very many, what in rough numbers are you talking about there?
I don't remember signing off on any.
Okay. Now, at the bottom of 0362, under qualifications, do you see there the third dot point? The third qualification is exceptional probity and credit clearance and ability to obtain key employee licence.
Yep.
In terms of the exceptional probity and credit clearance, what did you understand that to mean?
Means that you're able to obtain meet the requirements to be able to obtain a key casino employee licence. So you have to go through and complete the work or complete the documentation as required to obtain a licence. So from my point of view, I think it's a standard line that's in pretty much everyone's qualifications. to be able to have a key licence, because the key casino employee licence, without that you weren't able to hold the role. So
Did you understand that you were required to conduct yourself at all times in your role as General Manager of the cage operations with complete honesty and integrity
yes,
and according to law?
yes,
And did you also understand that you were not to tolerate any risk of dishonest or unlawful conduct by others related to or affecting the cage operations?
I believe the staff were responsible for performing their function, and I was to oversee and make sure that they were performing their function, yes.
What about third parties, such as patrons and others?
So can you repeat what
Did
the
you
question is in
understand that
regards
you
to
were-
third party?
Did you understand that you were not to tolerate any risk of dishonest or unlawful conduct by others, whether Crown employees or third parties, related to or affecting the cage operations?
The cage were allowed to deal with third parties. The cage were allowed to, there was no rule to stop us from sending funds to a third party or receiving funds from a third party.
So just come back.
So,
You just finished your answer, Mr Brown.
yeah, so there was, we were permitted to deal with third parties, and the staff were checking to make sure, or they were trying to meet their requirements in regards to what they were required to do from a third party transaction perspective. So,
Have you finished?
yes,
Right. Let me ask you the question again. Did you understand that in your role as General Manager of the cage operations, you were not to tolerate any risk of dishonest or unlawful conduct by third parties that was related to or affecting the cage operations?
I think our obligation was, as I said, it's very hard to say that we could oversee every transaction from a third party perspective and expect to know the complete legal background of every transaction that happened from a third party perspective. So therefore, we were overseeing what we could. Could we oversee everything from a third party perspective? I think with the information we had, we did the best we could, yes.
So, Mr Brown, here I'm asking you about your role and your responsibilities. Did you understand that you were not to tolerate any risk of which you were aware of dishonest or unlawful conduct by third parties that was related to or affecting the cage operations?
I think, as I said, I think that the obligation is to report and do anything if we think that the third party transaction was wrong, or third party was performing anything that we believe suspicious, and we should be reporting that.
So report but not prevent.
Well, it was very hard on our rules if we were to prevent the transaction completely, but already happened. We could reject payments and we could do things. But it wasn't, again, I wasn't checking every transaction in the cage, so I can't be responsible for every transaction that occurs within the cage that I haven't checked everything.
So transactions that came to your attention, was your responsibility just to report, or where you could also prevent?
Where I could, also prevent.
Thank you. And did you consider it your responsibility to also instill that approach into the cage staff who reported to you?
Yes, I believe so, yes.
And do you say you did that?
Yes, my staff were aware of the need to report on things and report on anything that they perceived to be not within the policy. Well, if it wasn't within the policy, they weren't to perform the role or perform the function. And if they thought that there was anything that outside that was within the policy that they thought was suspicious, then they should be reporting on that, yes.
And what about the prevention of dishonest or unlawful conduct? What did you...
If they believed it was dishonest, sorry to interrupt there, if they believed it was dishonest or wrong, then they should have prevented it, yes.
Now, finally, with respect to this document at 0363 at the bottom, there's a box that talks about decision-making and advice. And in the row, decisions this role makes alone, first bullet point, did you understand that all cage operational decisions were within your sole authority unless the issue involved high-profile patrons or approval of credit lines.
Yeah, I mean, in reading that, I think it's probably badly worded. I mean, again, it talks about decisions that make the all cage operational decisions. I don't know if I make all cage operational decisions and all count operational decisions, because, you know, a decision to, for example, issue a cheque to a patron is made by the staff involved in the transaction. So it's probably not fair to say that, again, I'm not there 24/7. I'm not the sole person operating. So I have an overview of decisions made in regards to changes or policies or things like that. Was I the sole person making decisions on all cage operations and all count operations? I don't think that's probably something I was performing, no.
If we look at if we look at the bottom row, decisions this role escalates, it says issue resolution involving high-profile patrons. What did you understand that to mean?
That would be dealing with our VVIP patrons, and if there was an issue with dealing with them, then I would escalate it to who I needed to escalate it to if there was a concern.
And how was it determined whether a patron was high-profile or VIP?
I don't think there was any standard. VIP was a general term used within the casino for anyone that played in our international room was considered, I think, to be VIP. From a high profile, I don't think there was a standard. You become a high profile person when you reached a certain level. I never saw a level. It was a general term used for people within our gaming and our VIP gaming area.
And where did decisions get escalated to involving?
It would depend on the decision.
Well,
it might be through to our finance team. It might be through to, depending on who I reported to. So it might have been through to Mr. McGregor when I reported to him, or Mr. Preston. If it was a legal matter, it could have been Mr. Felstead. It could have been to, if it was a international patron and it was a Melbourne-based decision, it might have been someone in Melbourne.
So can I just take you now back to your witness statement at pages, and well, starting at page 0009, between paragraphs 71 and 88, you outline the nature of the training cage staff receive.
Yep.
Does that evidence accurately outline the nature of training received for cage staff at Perth Casino between 2013 and 2015?
I believe that the training didn't really change throughout the time I was there. It was, you know, the training is given to the cashiers when they start and escalated up as they move up through the ranks. So I think it's a consistent approach, but 2013 to 20, a singular period, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's a consistent approach, yeah.
And that's a training program that you established, was it?
I was involved in, yes, it was something that I was aware of and overseeing, yes.
And as General Manager Cage and Count, you had the overall responsibility for the implementation of that training program, is that right?
Generally, we set it up. I had probably the overall. We worked in teams within the cage, so each of the shift managers would be allocated staff that they would work with, that they would train up, and then they would sign off on their training to say it had been completed. So it was probably more, again, the operational staff that were signing off and completing and making sure the training was done for the staff, and the staff were performing their roles at the required level because they worked in teams, and they would be in a better position to know if the staff were trained and trained efficiently or not.
But you accept you had the overall responsibility for training of the cage staff?
I would have to say that, yes.
Now, you refer from paragraph 82 onwards to the particular training that cage staff received in respect of anti-money laundering, or AML. But before we get there, can I just ask you this? Between 2013 and 2015, you had a general understanding, didn't you, that casino operations were vulnerable to the risk of being used to facilitate money laundering?
Oh, well, we had AML training. So, I mean, the AML training pointed out that there were, casinos could be used for money laundering, and that's why we would have our AML training, and we had an AML team and an AML program. So, yes.
Did you have a general understanding at that time that casino operations were vulnerable to the risk of being infiltrated by criminals and organised crime syndicates?
Probably wasn't something I was thinking about criminals and organised crime syndicates. No, generally it was, watching out and trying to watch out for each transaction and working out whether things were suspicious. But I probably wasn't sitting there thinking about is that organised crime or is organised crime trying to infiltrate the casino?
You had a general understanding, didn't you, between 2013 and 2015 that junket tours posed particular risks to casino operations in terms of being used to facilitate money laundering?
No, I don't think that I had a general understanding of that at all. We were dealing with junkets that we believed were that we wanted to deal with, that we were being asked to deal with. So we were documenting what we needed to do. Was I aware that they were being used by organised crime? No, I wouldn't think that's the case, no.
So just to be clear, between 2013 and 2015, you didn't have an appreciation that generally junkets posed risks to casino operations as being used as a means to facilitate money laundering?
No, I don't think I did, no.
You understood in general terms, though, didn't you, how money laundering could be facilitated through a casino's operations?
I had a general understanding of how money laundering could be used through a casino, yes.
And you understood in the context of money laundering the concept of structuring?
I understand structuring as it is. I understand that it occurs, but it wasn't heavily on our radar from a training perspective. We talk more about identifying suspicious matters rather than sitting down and going through structuring. Yes.
Well, it was identified heavily, wasn't it, back in 2013 to 2015?
Looking back on documents I've seen now, it was there. Was it something that we sat down and went through? We discussed generally, but we probably discussed more as a operational front window process, yes.
We go to the casino manual, the 2014 version, CRW.709.152.8086. And we go to page 8092. This is section 3A of the casino manual concerning the main bank. You would have been very familiar with this at the time, of course.
Yes.
And if we go down to section 2.1, which discusses suspicious matter reports.
Yeah, the structuring of cash transactions, which, being a cash transaction at the front window to avoid the requirement to prepare a threshold transaction, yes.
Yes. So it's the first bullet point in relation to what a suspicious matter may relate to.
Of cash transactions, yes.
Yes, one of the primary means of money laundering and suspicious transactions was structuring to avoid the preparation of a threshold transaction report.
Correct.
And you had input into this part of the casino manual, hadn't you?
Yes.
And if we go to one of the SOPs for the main cage that was operative at the time, CRW.708.019.
Darminand is on his feet.
Thank you, Commissioner. I understand that this document has matters which are of a nature that ought not to be on public screens because they reveal systems and processes that might be used by others in a way that would facilitate the very thing that is designed to inhibit.
All right, they should be limited to the screens of council and the commissioners and.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, if we go to CRW.708.019.2771, and I'll ask that not to be put on the public screen, thank you, as a precaution. This is a 2011 AUSTRAC reporting SOP. You prepared or approved the contents of this SOP, didn't you?
As the overseer of it, yes, I approve it. It's, but I don't know if I prepared it. So.
I beg your pardon?
I'm not sure if I prepared it, but I am aware of the contents of it. Yes.
My question was whether you prepared or approved the contents.
Well, the SOPs are not something that's actually signed off and approved. They're a document that we work with. But did I prepare it? I'm not sure if I did, but I'm certainly aware of the contents of it.
Did you object?
Did you
no,
I didn't.
At the bottom of page 2772, with reference to suspicious matter reporting, you see that there?
Yes.
It mentions that a suspicious matter does not have to exceed the $10,000 threshold. And then examples are given in the last dot point on the page of the structuring of cash outs.
Yep.
And you'll see over the page at 2773. First sub-dot point, breaking up of transactions to amounts below the $10,000 reporting requirement. Yep. And although this is expressed here as structuring in terms of cash outs, you well appreciated, didn't you, that similar types of structuring could occur in respect of payments into the casino for gaming purposes?
I think, this talks specifically in our SOPs, yes, about structuring of cash outs, you're right. So, but, if you're looking at transactions just below $10,000 or ways to avoid some sort of reporting, yes, it would report to funds coming in or funds coming out, yes.
And did you appreciate that might have a particular relevance to possible structuring in respect of junket buy-ins?
Junket buy-ins being junket buy-ins at the cage, or junket buy-ins from a
TT
fund sent for a TT? I'm not sure if it was only junket buy-ins, but certainly it probably would relate to every transaction in and out for the casino, yes.
Now, coming back to the AML training for the cage staff that you refer to at paragraph 82 of your witness statement, you had input into specifically the AML training that was formulated for cage staff, didn't you?
The training for the cage staff was done by a supervisor who receives, so the cage cashiers, when they first started, received training from our AML officer or a cage supervisor. It started as the AML officer, and it was a training document created by the AML officer who used to come and do the training of the cage staff on a regular basis. But as they got busier and their role become more involved, they handed it over to the cage supervisors to complete. Was I involved in that? I saw the document and know the document, but it was a document that was created by the AML team.
You had involvement, though, in terms of contribution to the content of the AML training program?
Yeah, but it was run by our AML team to make sure that the staff were being trained to the standard that they wanted them to be trained to. So it was an AML team created document, yes.
Now, in the second sentence, you say in respect of the training of cage staff that it goes through expectations in respect of two things, expectations in respect of their role and AUSTRAC reporting.
Yes.
Now, obviously they were expected to comply with all of the legal requirements for AUSTRAC reporting.
Around threshold transaction reporting and IFTI reporting, yes.
And SMR reporting?
SMR though is an obligation if somebody perceives something to be suspicious.
Yes.
So as a threshold report is an obligation regardless of whether they think it's suspicious or not, because it's an amount of cash above 10. And IFTI reporting is required for overseas, but suspect matter reporting is what a reasonable person considers to be suspicious.
Yes.
So therefore, is it an obligation to complete a suspect? Well, it depends on whether that person reasonably considers it to be suspicious.
That was something that cage staff were trained about, that if they formed a view about a suspicious matter, they had to instigate the raising of an SMR.
Yeah, absolutely.
And were they further trained, coming back to this point that I asked you about in relation to your own role a little while ago, that their AML responsibilities were not just to comply with reporting obligations, but also to prevent transactions that where they could, that were indicative of money laundering?
Yes, they were trained and trained with the cage and the AML team to look at those things, yes.
Now, just coming back to the suspicious matters, if we look at paragraph 83 of your witness statement, just to confirm what you're saying here. Cashiers are instructed to be vigilant in respect of AML and to escalate to management anything suspicious. So you expected cashiers to form a view about the transactions that were in front of them, that they were processing, as to whether or not they were suspicious.
Yes.
And that was the position between 2013 and 2015?
Yeah, that comment there, they talks about management would then complete an unusual activity report, which is a more recent process. So back in those days, cashiers were not the ones who would complete any suspicious matter, so they would raise it with the management. The management would then, in those days, raise a suspicious matter report, which would be sent directly to AML, or it might be referred via surveillance if they needed to get a copy of the patron or a photo of the patron.
Now, you gave evidence before the Bergen inquiry that cage staff were made aware through the online training they were given of the concept of structuring payments for the purposes of identifying suspicious matters. You recall that?
Yes.
And that was with respect to both the structuring of deposits as well as and cash outs?
I don't think the AML online training, and I might be wrong, I don't think it covers off structuring through bank accounts.
So
I haven't. I think it's because it's a general AML training that all staff complete. It's, if I remember correctly, it's only covers off structuring of payments more at the front window than it does through funds through the bank account. But I'd have to check back on that one. I'm not sure.
So do
I think it's front window.
So do I understand then what you're saying is that the AML online training focused on cash transactions at the main cage rather than electronic transactions, whether they were out or in to the bank account?
I believe so, because it was a general training that, as I said, it was performed, every member of Crown staff do the AML training, as far as I know. So it was aimed at all levels. So it talked more about physical transactions within the casino complex rather than specific to it. There's no specific cage-related AML online training.
So if we go to paragraph 86, please. You say the AML team worked closely with all cage management to ensure they have sufficient understanding of the AML practices. You mean there the supervisors, the shift managers, and you?
Yeah, there was an open understanding. So the cage management team would be required to check the next day any transactions were entered, and they would liaise directly with the AML team to ensure that they were there. And if there was any concerns, the AML team would reach out generally to the shift manager and speak to them about the concerns, and may speak directly to the supervisor involved to discuss what had happened if there was an incident. So yes, I believe they work quite closely together to oversee the operations, yes.
Did the supervisors and shift managers receive the same AML training as the cashiers?
Well, they receive it when they obviously start as a cashier and then they do their online training. Do they receive more training? Well, they receive training in what they then need to check. They need to receive further training when they become a supervisor in regards to checking of the reports associated with AML and how to complete a suspect matter report and what they need to do. When they step into the shift manager role, then they understand the bank accounts and receive more instructions there, but the training doesn't change that much. It's more about how they report things and what they do. They already know how to report suspects.
Can we go to page 0018 of your witness statement? I just want to ask you about paragraphs 178 to 180. .179, you say, in relation to this allegation of Crown Perth's bank accounts being used for money laundering. I'm aware this has been raised in the Bergen inquiry around cuckoo smurfing through the Riverbank account. And then at 180, this is what I'd like to have you clarify, please. You say Cage staff were aware of the need to report matters that they perceived were suspicious or not right, and you believe that they did so when dealing with each transaction. Then you say, however, the staff were not reviewing activity on the account in a broader sense to see whether structuring or smurfing was taking place. What do you mean by that last sentence?
We never talked specifically about just looking for certain aspects, whether it be cuckoo smurfing, whether it be structuring or smurfing or whatever it might be. You know, they were told that if they saw something that they believed to be suspicious, then they needed to report it. They all understood and understand their obligation to report something that they reasonably see to be suspicious, is what I was aiming at there or speaking of there.
But they were certainly instructed, weren't they, to detect and raise or report as a suspicious matter evidence of structuring of a transaction through a casino bank account to avoid the $10,000 mandatory reporting threshold.
They were instructed as part of their training to be on the lookout for structuring, but as we've said in the past, most of their training was in regards to cash outs and front window transactions. They were aware of the need to ensure that they were reporting something if they believed it to be suspicious, whether that was at the front window or through the bank accounts, yes. So
were they trained to detect as suspicious structuring into a casino bank account?
Were there specific training on it? I would have to say there's probably nothing documented on that.
Well, why wasn't there specific training on it?
Because I think they were aware of the need to report things if they felt they were suspicious.
So there was specific training on structuring of cash outs, yes?
Yes.
There was specific training on structuring either by way of payments in or payments out at the front window.
Yep.
But there was no training on structuring of payments into a casino bank account.
Not from me, whether it was from the AML team, but they were certainly, again, they were aware of the need that if they saw something to be suspicious, that they should report it. So whether that was through the bank account or over the front window, if they thought something was suspicious, their obligation was to report it.
Are you saying they were trained or they weren't trained in relation to identifying structuring as suspicious when it was a payment or payments into a casino bank account?
I don't think they were specifically trained just for the bank account. Right. They were trained to be on the lookout if a transaction was considered to be suspicious.
Well,
and they should be on the lookout for that. So, yes.
There was specific training for cash outs.
Correct.
There was specific training at the front window.
Yes.
Why not specific training for payments into the bank account?
Yeah, can't answer that. I'm sorry.
That's a convenient one, Commissioner.
Mr. Brown, we take a break now for 15 minutes, so we'll come back at 11:30 our time. That's still 1:30 your time, is it?
No worries. Thank you.
Please be seated. Thank you, Mr Brown.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, Mr Brown, before the morning break, you gave some evidence to the effect that the cage cashiers, although they might identify a matter that was suspicious, they themselves didn't complete an SMR. That was for somebody higher up to do. Is that right?
Yeah, the cage supervisors would complete, in conjunction with the cashier, they would have access to the SMR form that we were using at the time to be able to complete the information in conjunction with the cashier. So they would do it working with the cashier to enter the details and make sure that the information had all been completed.
Well, in fact, it was anyone higher than a cashier. So it could be a supervisor, it could be a shift manager,
Yes.
or it could be you who would,
Yes.
with the cashier, develop and complete the SMR.
Yeah, it could be anyone in cage management, yes.
And who was it that made the final decision about whether or not a matter was in fact suspicious and therefore an SMR should be completed?
The person who had the grounds for suspicion.
So
So there was never,
the
there was
cashier.
never a case.
Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. No, if a cashier came to a supervisor and said they thought something was suspicious, then my understanding would be that a suspicious matter report was raised and submitted to the AML team. So, yes.
So if the manager, whether it's a supervisor, a shift manager or you, took a different view and said, well, no, I don't think that's suspicious, an SMR would nevertheless be raised?
Well, it would depend on if I suppose there might be the time when they go, no, we've seen this patron, we know who they are, and we have all their details, and it's, in our mind, that's the way they gamble. And so it may not be raised, but I would have thought in a majority of cases, if somebody believes that a transaction is suspicious, then an SMR would have been raised and would have been submitted through to the AML team, yes.
So on those less common occasions where the matter is taken to the manager above the cashier and the cashier, and the manager forms a different view, who has the final decision about whether or not an SMR is raised?
It would be a consultation. I would have thought that if a cashier was adamant that it was a suspect matter, then it should be raised. If the supervisor then was through an explanation to a cashier, explained to him that they didn't think it was, then maybe it would not be raised. But I would have thought in nearly all cases it would be raised unless there was sufficient grounds to suggest there's no reason to raise it.
And that was the position that pertained between 2013 and 2015?
I would have thought so. I think that's a position that's been in play the whole time, yes.
And the SMR was a paper form that was completed in the first instance, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a form that was created, so it wasn't the standard AML form for an SMR. It was a form that had all the information that was required by the AML team to complete the SMR documentation that was required. And so therefore it was a form that was available on each of the drives within the cage for the staff to be able to upload the information, but it was a manual form, yes.
And it was then subsequently entered into Psycho, was it?
No, SMRs are not entered into Psycho, no.
Right. Can I then just ask you about some evidence that you gave to the Bergen inquiry, BGN.0002.0001.2072 at 2136? And then if we look at line 9, you're being asked about some obligations, and you say the cage staff under anti-money laundering are required to review any transaction to report anything they believe to be suspicious. You see that there?
I'm just reading it, sorry. And, yep.
And
Yep.
you go on to say at 15 that it's reported through to the AML team at Crown Perth.
Yep.
Now, if we drop down to line 17, you're asked how that would have been done in the period 2013 to 2016, and you mention it's an internal AML report. And was that a hard copy document or was it part of the psycho system? And you say, well, it's just a hard copy document that's forwarded on. At line 25, do you see that?
Yes.
Now, if we go back to your witness statement at paragraph 84, in relation to SMR forms, they're trained in acceptable ID and completing entry into the details into psycho from which AML reporting is completed. Does that have anything to do with, sorry, is that consistent with your evidence in Bergen?
No, SMRs are not entered into psycho. So an SMR is not entered into psycho. Everything else that there is, it's a hard copy form that is forwarded on to the AML team. They are trained in all aspects of how to complete an SMR or now a UAR form, but they are not entered into the psycho system.
Right. So should we read that second sentence in 84 as talking only about
The ID.
the acceptable ID?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. But yes, it's to do with the ID is in psycho and now into Louis, but they need to ensure that the ID details are in the system for completing their reports.
Were cage staff required to notify you before an SMR was provided to the AML team?
No, there's no obligation. So in SMR, again, SMRs, as we know, are difficult because it shouldn't be any tipping off or advising. So therefore, it wasn't something that we sent copies to everybody to say we've done an SMR. An SMR was done. It was done by the staff member who completed the SMR, and they forwarded it on to the AML team.
But you were the general manager of the cage. Surely it was important for you to know if there was a suspicious matter occurring in relation to cage transactions or cage operations.
Yeah, it wasn't part of our agreed process. It was that the SMRs would be done and sent straight to the AML team. If the AML team then had a concern with it, they would probably come back to me if there was a concern.
So, irrespective of the process, in fact, were you told by cage staff when an SMR was sent to AML?
No, not in. There might be the odd time if I was copied in, but in general, I wouldn't know how many SMRs were being completed and how many were being done on a daily basis. That would be the AML team to look at that and review that.
So these SMRs were sent to the AML team, and who made the final decision about whether or not an SMR was sent to AUSTRAC?
The AML team.
And did they do that in consultation with the cage staff?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Once it was submitted, then my expectation would have been that, you know, if the cage staff have raised a suspicion, then based on the way the SMRs were reported, then the AML team would then report the SMR through to AUSTRAC.
Were you consulted before the AML team reported to AUSTRAC?
No.
We come back to the SOP, CRW.708.019.2771 for AUSTRAC reporting. That's not on the public screen, thank you. At 2773. If you remember, actually, if we can put 2772 and 2773 together on the screen, thank you, rather than 774. So you see at the bottom of 2772, that's where it starts talking about suspicious matter reporting.
Yep.
And over at 2773, do you see halfway down the popped out part of the text? It says, when faced with a suspicious matter, cashier must alert a member of cage management.
Yep.
And then we drop down to, if you miss out the next bullet point, then the one after that, after the transaction, the person who has determined the matter to be suspicious will complete an SMR. It's not clear precisely who that person is supposed to be, who's determining the matter to be suspicious. You'd agree?
I would have thought that it's the supervisor that it's, or the cage management member, sorry for the term, who has been informed of the suspicion by either the cashier or what they've raised.
Right. But that,
So is it clear? But it says after the transaction, the person who has determined the matter to be suspicious will complete, but it's completed in consultation with the cashier.
yes, but that process that you described to me before, where the cashier takes it to management and they consult, and then if there's a difference of view, then typically the cashier's view about whether or not it's suspicious holds.
Yep.
How did cashiers know that that was the position and that was the procedure?
I'm not sure if they do, but they would be consulting with management. I don't know if the management, then it would depend on the discussion at the time. But as I said, it would be a very rare occasion that a suspect matter wouldn't be created, a report wouldn't be created if a cage cashier or any employee said that they believe something to be suspicious, then they would complete the report. So, do the cashiers know it's been completed? They would be there at the time because it would be done at the time. It wouldn't be something you'd take notes on and do later, because the process was quite simple and it was on every PC and available on each PC. So I would think that it would have been done at the time and the staff member would be aware that it was done and submitted. Now, obviously they may not get a copy of the email through to the AML team, but they would see that it was being done and probably satisfied that it was done.
Now, that second highlighted bullet point commences with the words after the transaction. Was the procedure of the cage to always process suspicious transactions and raise a report subsequent to processing?
Well, you really can't submit a suspect matter report in front of a patron, because you would be tipping them off that you were doing it. So you're not going to do it at the time that the patron's standing in front of you. Otherwise, you're subject to the tipping off process. So you need to wait until you've completed your suspicion, determine what it is, and then you would complete a report once you had all the facts. Now, that's not, I don't think, saying that you'll necessarily go ahead with a transaction, but you're not going to do it while the patron's standing in front of you, because it would get you into other side of aspects with regards to tipping off.
Or how would a cashier reading this procedure understand that there might be, if you will, an intermediate point between ostensibly accepting the transaction in front of the patron but not processing it after the patron had left?
Because a cage supervisor would be involved. If they come and alerted to the supervisor, if they thought something was suspicious, they would alert the supervisor to the transaction. So the transaction would generally involve a cage supervisor, cage management member, and the cashier. They would then determine what the transaction was, whether the transaction went ahead, and whether it was suspicious or not. So, but they would wait until they'd completed that to make sure that they had all the information before completing their suspect matter report.
I want to ask you about the process involving the release of funds received by Perth Casino by way of telegraphic transfer, again with respect to the period 2013 to 2015. Telegraphic transfers were a service provided to gaming patrons, weren't they, relevantly to deposit front money ahead of a visit to the casino?
Or to redeem an outstanding line once they'd finished their gaming activity, yes.
And you understood between 2013 and 2015 that telegraphic transfers were primarily overseas transfers received into Crown Perth's bank account?
I don't have the records of the number of transactions completed. There were also local patrons who were transferring money, but I would say it would probably be more international, but I don't have the figures in front of me. I'm sorry.
And those international transactions were either as part of a junket or an individual high roller depositing monies to Perth Casino's bank accounts?
Yes.
And if we look at this SOP, not on the public screen, thank you, CRW.529.001.9093. This is the SOP for telegraphic transfers as at December 2013, and you obviously had input into this SOP, didn't you?
Yes.
And were responsible for maintaining it?
And I'm responsible. Well, it's a cage document, so as me being the head of the cage, then I would say then, yes, I would be responsible for maintaining it.
Now, I want to ask you, first of all, about the process, the processing of cleared funds. I'm not going to ask you about every single step of the process as it's set out in the SOP, but just certain parts of it. So if we go to page 9095, and the bottom quarter of the page, you see there inward telegraphic transfers under the heading of operating procedures. What we see there are steps to be taken by a cashier, is that right?
I don't see where it says cashier.
I'm
The
asking.
cashiers weren't involved in the telegraphic transfer process.
I beg your pardon?
So the cashiers weren't involved in the telegraphic transfer process.
I see. So it was all
So
done.
if there was a cashier in the Pearl room, they may be involved in signing off on the documentation or processing the final transaction through the account once it had been completed. But in all cases of a telegraphic transfer, it required at least one member of cage management.
So that's supervisor or up.
Yes.
And so these steps then are to be understood as being carried out by a supervisor or higher.
Yes, I would read it that way, yes.
Right. The first step is they go onto the bank's website where the casino holds its bank account and checks daily. They check daily for any new deposits. Is that right?
Yes.
And then they check the deposited details to see if they can identify the depositor.
Yes.
And then if we go over to 9096, second bullet point, the TT or telegraphic transfer is then issued.
Yep.
And the second half of the page, that process for issuing the TT is set out. No, second half of the page, please. Pop that back in. So the first bullet point refers to the completion of a requisition form.
Yep.
Now, was that typically done in 2013 to 2015 by a supervisor or a manager?
I believe it would have been done by a manager at that time.
Can I just ask you about these particular forms and the roles of the people completing them? This document's not to be put on the public screen, CRW.707.031.1146. If we look up the top, there's a name there
Yep.
as to who's prepared it. Who's that? Can you tell me who that person was?
That person is Maxine Karamovsky, who was, I believe, at that time a cage shift manager.
All right. And then if we look at this document, not on the public screen, CRW.707.031.5080. Ms. Shantanon, what was her position at the time?
He was a cage administrator.
Not a manager.
She held a key licence, so she was part of the management team. She held a key licence and from time to time performed in the role of cage supervisor, but her official title was cage administrator. But I think with any of the transactions that she completed at the time, they were signed off by a member of cage management, so she was facilitating the documentation.
All right, now if we just stay with this document as an example, this was the form that was filled out. In fact, this looks like an early release one, so I'll give you one for cleared funds so that we can see exactly how it worked. CRW.707.031.0389, not on the public screen, please. So this is a typical example of a TT processed for cleared funds. Is that right?
It's not telling me that it's not clear funds, but with what I'm seeing there, I couldn't tell you if it was for clear funds or not, because there's not enough information for me to make that determination based on just looking at that front page.
All right, so you would have to look at the pages behind to see the material that was provided with it.
Yes. Yeah,
Now,
that form there doesn't give me enough.
all right, so we'll come to that in a moment, but it was the case, wasn't it, that this form was prepared in multiple copies, 5 copies in fact.
4 or 5, yeah. I think it could be 5, but it's at least 4, yes.
There was a white, a yellow, a green, a blue and a pink form.
Okay.
Is that right?
I believe so. I can't quite read the bottom of the document on what it says. But.
And the person preparing the form was required to attach documentation to the form, weren't they? That clearly showed the deposit for the cleared funds into the casino's bank account.
Yes.
And that, of course, was vital in order that the cage could release the funds to know that the monies were actually cleared and sitting in the casino's bank account.
If they haven't been early released, yes.
Yeah. And if we go to page 0390, that's what we've got here, isn't it? Evidence of the
Transactions
deposits.
into the bank account, yes.
Yeah. And then at 0391, got some information from Crown Melbourne about the identity of the depositor.
Yes.
And then at 0392 and following,
Copies of the individual transactions, yes.
right. And that's fairly typical as to how these paper forms for a telegraphic transfer were prepared. Is that right?
The request was that for every transfer that was prepared, that it required supporting documentation showing where the money had come into the bank account and any additional supporting documentation that was available to support the transaction, yes.
Now, if we go back to the SOP, not on the public screen, thank you, CRW.529.001.1093 at page 9101. That tells you at the top where each of the coloured copies goes, right?
Yes.
Now, once you've got the paperwork, the multiple copies, and the supporting documentation, is it at that point that the transaction's entered into psycho?
Generally, it would be because it needs to establish a number. So it would be established with a number into psycho, but not attributed to the patron until the funds were being applied to their account.
Yeah. But here we had that depositor identified, so the psycho transaction could be processed at that point, couldn't it?
It would be entered as a transaction, but it wouldn't be, in my eyes and my understanding, and probably the rest of the cage understanding, would be it wasn't processed until the patron was actually there, or in the case that it was redeeming an outstanding line, it would be processed based on the request of the patron to do so. But there's two steps of entering it into psycho: obtaining the name number, and then that records it and gives it a number in the system from a reporting perspective, but it's not applied against their account until such time as we're prepared to do so.
All right, now come back to the SOP, please, as it is on the screen at page 9101, looking at where these coloured copies go. If we just pop that out again as it was, with the first 4 dot points pulled out, please. So the white and green copies, so that's the white original and the green copies with all of the original documentation attached to it, goes to the Pearl Room cage. That was at a time when the Pearl Room hosted international patrons.
Yeah, we were hosting international patrons back then, yes.
And the idea behind sending these 2 copies to the Pearl Room cage was so that when the patron presented to basically receive their chips for the deposit, the transaction would be noted on the white and green copies, and the patron would take the green copy, would they?
I'm not sure the patron got a copy of the document, no. I don't believe they got a copy of any of the documentation. They got a copy of the receipt when the funds were transferred into their psycho account, but I don't believe they got a copy of any of the TT portion of it.
Now, with what then happened to the white and green copies after the patron arrived and the transaction was completed?
I'm not sure about the green copy. I can't, my memory doesn't run on what happened to the green copy. The white copy was the document that the patron signed, agreeing that the transaction was going to go ahead, and that was then used to deposit the funds into the patron's account, and then that would become supporting documentation for the cage to balance their float effectively at the end of the shift.
Right. And did that go into a file in the cage?
No, that all supporting, so that would then, at the end of the shift, when the cashier finished, they would turn that document into our main bank area to reconcile the daily documentation and complete their reporting for the day, and then it would have been forwarded on with that paperwork to our income control team down in finance.
Well, let's have a look at this SOP. The blue copy, that's the 3rd dot point, goes to income control.
Yep.
So do you say the white copy and the blue copy go to income
control? Yes.
And where is income control housed?
It's part of finance. It sits within the finance team.
So that's where the reconciliation happened.
Yeah, all paperwork from the cage on a daily basis is completed and forwarded to the income control team for their review and for them to ledger and report as required.
So the yellow copy, which attaches a copy of all the original attachments that are on the white copy, is forwarded to the Finance Telegraphic Transfers officer. What was?
Yeah, I don't know if that's an official title, but it's what the cage referred to it as, and it was a person within the finance team, and whether they were, I don't think their title would have been finance TT officer, but they would have been a person within the finance team that were responsible for the telegraphic transfer process.
Well, what do you mean by that, responsible for the telegraphic transfer process?
Well, the finance team monitor the bank accounts the same as we do, but if we were sending a TT to a patron, there was a person in finance generally who was the person responsible for sending the telegraphic transfer to a patron. They would be the person that would receive this copy of the funds coming in as well. Now, what they did with it, I'm not sure, but they certainly received a copy with the attachments to it, yeah.
And then the pink copy at the bottom is filed in the cage. Is it in the cage's TA release file?
Yes.
And TA stands for, in rough terms, TT's approved.
Yeah, it's a transfer acknowledgement, TA. So transfer acknowledgement is funds coming in and a TR is a transfer request of funds going out.
Now, the SOP does not provide for any copy of the paperwork to be provided to the AML team. Yet when we go to paragraph 27 of your witness statement at page 0004, you describe the TT paperwork as being split up and, amongst other things, being provided to the AML team.
The AML team, and more recently, they have received copies, I believe, of all TTs.
Yeah.
Because after this time, and I'm not sure what was happening in 13 to 15, but they had copies of all TTs because they were saved additionally into a shared file that could be viewed by the AML team with all supporting documentation as well.
Right, but just to be clear, at paragraph 27, you're not suggesting that as at 2013 to 2015, the AML team received any of the TT paperwork?
According to that, no. They wouldn't have potentially received it back in 2013.
And if we go to page 0014, paragraph 133, last sentence, you're talking about the TT process again. You're not suggesting that between 2013 and 2015, supporting paperwork for TTs was sent to AML team for review?
According to what the documentation suggests, no. But it was available for them to review, but it wasn't sent.
If we go to paragraph 163 at page 0017, go to 0017, please. I have a frozen screen, I'm told, Mr. Brown, so you just have to bear with me. So if we come back to 163, you say all transactions were fully documented and passed on to the finance and AML teams. You're not suggesting there that between 2013 and 2015, the paperwork supporting a TT clearance was provided to the AML team?
I don't think it was provided, but it was available. Yes.
And coming back to the TT forms and the paperwork that was prepared, the SOP was set up in such a way that you didn't need to be involved at all in the completion of that paperwork. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, the paperwork could come in at any time of the day or night. So again, I wasn't there enough time 24/7 to be doing it. So the responsibility lay with the shift managers at the time, or the generally the most senior person or who it was delegated to within the management team to perform that function.
Now, you therefore wouldn't have seen the paperwork for every single TT that was prepared.
No.
But did you make it your business to check some of those transactions periodically to satisfy yourself that the standard procedures were being followed?
No, I'm probably not as a routine checking it, no, because again, it was split up and sent to so many areas that I felt that if there was an issue with it, it would have been referred to me.
Well, shouldn't you have just from time to time had a look at the paperwork to make sure it was all in order?
Looking in hindsight, I probably should have, yes.
You authorised some TTs yourself though, didn't you?
I would have thought very few, but I was part of the management team, so if there was a need to, I could have done it, but I wouldn't have thought that I would have done many, no.
Now, not on the public screen, please. CRW.707.031.4047. That's your signature
Yes.
authorising the TT at the bottom.
Yes.
And is it the case that when Ms. Chantanon, if that's how you say her name, prepared one of these forms, you typically authorised it?
I wouldn't say typically, but if there was no one else around to complete the transaction, then I may have signed off on some, but I wouldn't say typically, no.
Now, can I take you to paragraph 129 of your witness statement at page 0014? Here you're giving some evidence about Crown Perth's bank accounts. I just want to understand what you mean by the last sentence.
What I mean there is we were, as it says there, users, viewers of the bank accounts. So, I mean, if it came to, we would process the transaction. So we would view the transaction, process it through the psycho system and make the funds available to the patron. But if the patron was the person wanting to send a telegraphic transfer, we would again facilitate the process. We would forward it to our finance team who had the ability then to actually process the transaction through the account.
So can I
So
just...
we weren't operating on the bank account.
So let me just understand that. You processed all of the paperwork, but it was then finance who actually went into the bank account and released the funds to the patron.
No, we released it into psycho to the patron. What I'm saying is we didn't have ability to process officially. What we were doing was transferring the funds to the patron into their casino management account to allow them access to gaming. We weren't there transferring funds into the, we didn't have the ability to transact officially onto the bank account or process transactions through the bank account or move funds from one account to another or transfer funds out to a patron.
Well, you did to the extent that you were a signatory on accounts such as Riverbank, didn't you?
I was a signatory, but I didn't process any that I'm aware of, apart from signing gaming checks, because we're all signatories for gaming checks. I don't believe I would have processed any transactions apart from being a signatory on the Riverbank account, yes.
Now, can I ask you some questions about the processing of telegraphic transfers for the early release of funds before they were cleared into the casino's bank account, which I think was described as an early release of funds? You know what I'm talking about here?
Yes.
And a manager could not normally process such a TT by themselves, could they?
They had to do an early release of funds. A manager can process it into the patron's account once they've obtained approval from somebody within the approval matrix.
Well, that was the CEO, the COO or the CFO under the SOP, wasn't it?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. So you couldn't provide that authority for the early release?
No, I had no authority to approve an early release. It had to come from at least, I believe it was, as you said there, only CFO, COO or CEO that could do it. I think for a period of time also, Mr. Preston could do it in his role as Chief Legal Officer, or what his title was at the time, I'm not sure.
Can we go back to the SOP, please, not on the public screen, CRW.529.001.9093 at 9102. At 9102. So here's a checklist that's attached to the SOP.
Yeah,
And it actually provides for different circumstances in which an early release of funds can be approved by different members of Crown staff. You see that?
yeah, I do.
So a TT from Crown Melbourne could be approved by the cage shift manager on an initial basis at least, couldn't it?
If it was coming from Crown Melbourne, though, it wasn't really considered an early release because it was coming from Melbourne. So I can't remember back to what was happening back in 2013 with that, but coming from Crown Melbourne, it wasn't considered to be an early release as far as I'm aware.
Well, under this heading of early release authority, it then talks about a TT sent from another Crown property, which meant that either you or, was it Mr. Mitchell, could release the funds? Yeah. Did that happen?
I'm not sure what another Crown property would be considered to be at that stage. So obviously the first reference is to Crown Melbourne. The other Crown property, I'm not quite sure what that's referring to at that stage.
You see there underneath that TT sent from external bank account, it had approval to release must be sought from you or Mr. McGregor as CFO.
Yeah.
So what happened in practice? Because that seems different from the process you just described to me.
Yeah, I never approved an early release. I didn't have approval authority to do an early release. So I'm not sure why that's there, but certainly I was not in a position to approve an early release, and it had to be one of our executive people, which was, again, Alan, at the time CFO, would have been one of those people. But I certainly didn't have any approval authority for early release of funds.
Right, if we go back to your witness statement, please, at paragraph 24, page 0004, in the second sentence. You say early release process is an approved process by the regulator and requires approval from those within the approval matrix, but generally at least one of the level 1 executive management would be required.
Yes.
What do you mean by level 1 executive management there?
Again, we had different, in the approval matrix, it listed the different people. So the executive management would from time to time change. So if they were a level 1 executive manager, they could approve under the approval matrix. And that was, again, CEO, COO, CFO. And then I think, as I said, Mr. Preston in his title, which I think was Executive General Manager Legal Services, also fell into that area with the ability to sign off as an approver.
Now, you express that as a general position. Were the exceptions as they were set out in the checklist attached to the SOP? That is...
There was an approval matrix that would have been attached to the SOP, yes.
Well,
and they varied. There was also, I believe, from time to time, Mr. Tyler from Melbourne and Jacinta Maguire were also included in that level 1 executive management who could sign off an early release.
And but there's that checklist attached to the SOP that identifies exceptions to that general position for Crown Melbourne and other Crown properties where someone else can approve. Is that what you're referring to here as the
No, I think we, as far as I know, operationally, we always obtained from one of the level one executives to early release funds. I don't remember going to anyone but a level one executive to release funds. And even to this day in Perth, I believe that's still the case.
So when there was an early release of funds, did you typically involve yourself in checking the process for approving that early release and the preparation of the paperwork?
No, because the early release was approved and would have been a discussion between the person preparing it and the level one executive. There was an option in Psycho then when it was entered to enter it and record it as an early release of funds, and it was also noted on the documentation that it was an early release of funds.
Now, when the paperwork was prepared, obviously because it was an early release, you wouldn't have a bank statement showing the deposits into the casino's bank accounts, correct?
In most cases, yes.
So what was required to be attached to the paperwork was any information that proved that a deposit had been made but not cleared. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
And when the transaction was entered into Psycho, was it required to note that an early release had been authorised?
At some stage, and I can't tell you whether it was between 13 and 15, Psycho, I believe, was updated with a field in there that asked whether it was an early release, yes or no. But I couldn't tell you when that was done.
An important component of the paperwork attached to the paper forms was that email or other written authorisation from the person who was authorised to approve the early release.
Yes, the early release would be done via a phone call because it could occur at any time of the day or night. Again, the transactions occurred at all times, but there would be a follow-up email from the person obtaining the early release to, whether it was Mr. McGregor, for example, it would be an email to Mr. McGregor asking him to confirm his verbal authorisation for the early release of the funds.
Now, Mr. Brown, the SOP provides that the paperwork for an early release is not to be distributed until the funds are cleared in the casino's bank account. When the funds were cleared and the paperwork was distributed, did it attach also evidence of the bank deposits?
It would have attached everything that came in from an early release perspective, yes.
Can I show you this one on the public screen? Not on the public screen, I meant to say. CRW.707.031.4604. And this is an early release that you signed off on at 4604. If we go to 4606, Cage staff were notified of the early release, and that was a typical requirement that everyone in the cage had to be notified if funds were released early. Is that right?
Yep.
So that they weren't paid twice.
Yes.
And then at 4607, to 4608, put those side by side, please. 4608's barely legible, but you get the sense of the thing by looking at 4607, or 4608's a bit illegible. But that's the sort of information that would be provided before the funds were cleared in the casino's account to show that the deposits had actually been made. Is that right?
Yep.
But I think that's the end of that form. We don't see any bank statement showing the cleared funds.
Yep. But as you'll see there, and you'll note that it talks about a funds collection receipt. So a funds collection receipt is coming from City of Dreams. So the funds collection receipt was City of Dreams, which was a Crown affiliated property at that time, I believe when it was 2013, were holding funds on behalf of a patron that were released, early released at Crown Perth for their gaming activity. Now, without seeing more of the transaction, if the patron had a win, that funds may have been handed back to the patron at the end of their gaming, rather than the funds being sent to Perth only to be returned back to Perth, to Macau for the facilitation. But I can't see that from the documentation you've shown me there.
But it is your evidence that if the funds were cleared, ultimately cleared into the casino's account and used for gaming, when the paperwork was distributed, it ought to have attached to it the bank statement from the casino's bank account with the cleared deposits shown in it.
If there was no deposit made though, it couldn't show a transaction that was made.
But if it did, if there was a deposit, then it
If there was a deposit, I would expect that the deposit paperwork would be shown to it, yes.
Thank you. Now, if we go back to your witness statement at paragraph 26, page 0004, first sentence. Do I understand from that first sentence, Mr. Brown, that even if the funds were cleared in the casino's account at the time that the telegraphic transfer was being processed, it had to be treated in terms of process and form as an early release?
More recently, and I couldn't tell you more recently means and when that started, all TTs that haven't been in the bank account for a period of 24 hours will be treated as an early release.
In 2013 to 2015 were transactions that were cleared on the same day that they were paid, treated as an early release within the cage?
I couldn't tell you for sure. I'm not sure, as I said, when it started, but I think they may have been, but I'm not sure of that one. I'm sorry.
Now, I want to ask you some questions about the Riverbank accounts, Mr. Brown. You were aware at the time in early to mid 2013 that HBSC shut down the Riverbank accounts held with that bank on the basis that it had decided to no longer provide banking services to the gaming sector. Is that right?
My understanding was that HSBC closed all our accounts due to not wanting to deal with gaming sector, yes. And
that was it was then that the Riverbank accounts were moved to ANZ in October 2013?
I assume so. I think it was some stage after the HSBC closed or just prior to them closing that accounts were established with ANZ, yes.
You became a signatory on the ANZ accounts in the name of Riverbank Investments?
I'm not sure. I was a signatory on the ANZ AUD account. I'm not sure whether I signed any further documentation needing to sign any documentation to further become a signatory on the overseas accounts. I'm not sure about that.
On the AUD account, you had the capacity, therefore, to review transactions on the accounts at any time?
Yep.
Now, in February 2014, Mike McGreevy, the General Manager of Security and Surveillance at Crown Perth, discussed with you, didn't he, unusual deposits made into the Riverbank account?
I don't remember talking to Mike McGreevy about unusual deposits in the bank account.
And not on the public screen, please. CRW.529.0001.9157. We go to 9158, as these email chains work backwards, Mr. Brown.
Yep.
You'll see that, no, if you pop that back, please. So I can see the two documents side by side. Can you read them reasonably easily, Mr. Brown?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. You'll see at the very bottom of 9157 an AFP, the header, email header.
Yep.
And notification from AFP about a money laundering investigation. The target having made structured deposits into an ANZ bank account for Riverbank Investments, asking some questions.
Yep, I can see that.
And you'll see at 9157, Mr McGreevy then forwards that to Mr Preston.
Yep.
And do you see, he says, Josh, this arrived today and it relates to the patron that's nominated there. We discussed last week with Craig Spence and David Brown, re the unusual deposits into our account. So that was something that you were aware of at the time?
According to what's written there, but I don't remember speaking to Mike about a particular incident. No.
Was the patron mentioned at 9157 a high value patron?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, and I'm not sure what you determine to be a high value patron. So.
Well, high value patron as is written in your job description.
He would have been being a Malaysian patron and coming in and depositing money in our account. He would have been a VIP into our gaming room. So,
in any event, you accept by looking at this email that at the time you had raised with you a suspicion of structuring occurring through deposits made to the River Bank account by this patron.
oh, that's what's stated there, but I don't remember having that discussion with Mr McGreevy at the time.
Do you recall whether you checked at this time to see whether an SMR had been raised with respect to the transaction identified here?
No, I don't. But
Ms van der Klauw has provided the Commission, this Royal Commission, with a schedule. I'll display it, but not on the public screen, Mr Brown, CRL.725.001.0166, which shows at page 0168 you see that middle entry there?
yep,
No SMR for that transaction.
yep.
Can you explain that?
No, I can't explain that.
Would you agree that it was a failure on the part of the cage to have not submitted an SMR in relation to that transaction?
Again, if the person doing it perceived it to be suspicious, they should have raised an SMR.
Do you accept that it was a failure of the cage not to have raised an SMR in respect to this transaction?
In looking at that transaction there, knowing what we know, then I would expect an SMR would have been raised, yes.
Do you accept that it was a failure on the part of the cage to have not raised an SMR with respect to that transaction?
It looks like it should have been raised, an SMR for that transaction.
Yeah. Do you accept that it was a failure on the part of the cage to not raise an SMR in respect of that transaction?
I don't know if it's a failure of the cage. It's a failure of the person who performed the transaction who should have completed an SMR if they believed it was suspicious.
Now, you say at paragraph 66 little a at page 0008 of your witness statement that you were involved in ongoing monthly compliance meetings, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
And you mention at 97, page 0011, that you sat on the Risk and Compliance Committee between 2005 and 2020. That was sometimes called the Legal Compliance Committee, wasn't it?
Yes.
Do you recall reporting this transaction as a non-compliance to the Risk and Compliance or Legal Compliance Committee?
I'm not sure. I don't have a record of whether I reported it or didn't report it.
Let's go to the minutes of the Legal Compliance meeting of the 21st of March 2014, which you attended, CRW.008.002.1167. So this is the month after the transaction I just showed you, Mr Brown. And if we go to page 1168, see at the top, AML certificate completed, no incidents. And
Yep.
for the cage, there's no reference to that transaction. See that?
Yep.
Can you explain why you didn't raise this with the committee as a non-compliance?
No, again, I wasn't aware that an SMR hadn't been completed. because I'm not aware of all SMRs being completed. So the way the compliance certificates would also work, and in the meetings would be, the AML team would, if they had concerns that a transaction had completed and they felt an SMR was required, they would have raised it in their portion of the illegal compliance.
But Mr Brown, this was a transaction that was expressly and specifically raised with you by others as something that was the subject of an AFP investigation. You would have, I suggest, been very keen to understand whether an SMR had been raised or not.
Yes, and in hindsight, I should have looked more into whether an SMR had been raised for that transaction.
Just coming back on the way through to ask you about risk and compliance meetings, you normally didn't attend those even though you were a member, is that right?
If I wasn't available to attend, I would delegate to one of the staff to attend that on my behalf. So at times Mr Mitchell would attend when he was there, and after that time, Ms Karen would attend from time to time on my behalf, or I would attend some of the meetings, yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, the from time to time on your behalf, was that about 70% of the time?
It was regular, yes.
So you only attended roughly about 30% of the time?
I would attend as required, yes.
Well, you were a member, so you were required to attend all the time, weren't you?
No, because you're a member or you have a delegate who can attend on your behalf. So there needs to be somebody from the cage, but it doesn't necessarily, and it was never an instruction that I had to attend. And if I was asked to attend or I was told that I must attend in those days, I would attend. Now, I think that's changed a little bit more recently with the approach, but at the time, there was you or a delegate could attend as long as there was somebody from the cage there to attend the meetings.
Did you place much importance on the work of the Compliance Committee between 2013 and 2015?
I believe we did. I believe we completed our requirements in regards to what we needed to report from a compliance perspective, so yes. And those meetings would call out if they felt there was something that hadn't been reported or needed to be reported.
I'm talking about you, Mr Brown. Did you place much importance on the work of the Compliance Committee between 2013 and 2015?
I believe I did, yes.
Do you recall ever having reported a non-compliance by the cage to the Compliance Committee?
For AML or for anything?
For AML?
I'm not sure without seeing it, no.
Well, do you mean unless I show you a document you won't remember?
Well, I can't remember. They were monthly certificates and you're talking a 2-year period. I can't be sure what I completed on monthly certificates over a 2-year period, I'm sorry.
So let's expand the time frame then for the purposes of this question. Do you remember ever yourself reporting an AML non-compliance to the Compliance Committee?
Yes.
And when was that?
I couldn't tell you, but I did complete AML non-compliance and it formed part of compliance certificates, but I couldn't give you dates and times, but I know they were done. Yeah, but I couldn't tell you when they were, but they were done. And Ms van der Klauw, we used to work with her at times to complete non-compliance with AML, yes.
And about how many times do you recall reporting AML non-compliances?
No, I couldn't tell you, I'm sorry.
Well, 1 or 10 or 100?
No, it's certainly more than 1, whether it's 10 or 20, I'm not sure. But AML non-compliance was reported on compliance certificates.
Right, coming back to this particular transaction in February 2014, that was the subject of the AFP investigation. As a consequence of learning of that transaction, did you take any steps at that point in time to ensure that the cage cashiers were alert to reporting to cage management, possible structuring of deposits to casino bank accounts so that an SMR could be raised?
I don't believe so, no.
Well, why not?
I don't remember the incident. I don't remember the discussion with Mr McGreevy, and I don't know if there was any further follow-up. So I'm not sure.
Though you don't
But-
remember whether or not you took any steps to amend the SOP or casino manual?
No,
Do you recall alerting Mr McGregor of the issue?
no, I don't remember alerting, but Mr Spence was also involved, so I don't know at that time whether I was reporting to Mr McGregor or Mr Spence.
Did you raise with Mr Bossy or Mr Felsted whether Perth Casino should continue to accept that patron to Perth Casino?
No, not that I'm aware of, no.
Now, a month later, March 2014, you became aware that ANZ was concerned about potential structuring of transactions through the Riverbank account, weren't you?
I'm not sure. I don't remember having any discussions with the ANZ about their concerns over that, no.
You became aware, didn't you, irrespective of whether you recall discussions, that ANZ was concerned about potential structuring of transactions through the Riverbank accounts?
I was aware that ANZ were concerned about the accounts, hence they closed the accounts on us. I'm not sure I was aware of whether they were looking at structuring or just general transactions through the accounts.
If we go to this document, not on the public screen, CRW.529.001.9090, now this is not an email that was written by you or sent to you on the face of it, Mr Brown. I want to be clear about that. But Ms van der Klauw to Mr Preston says in the second paragraph, DB feels that ANZ's concerns are regarding numerous deposit amounts under the threshold completed at multiple branches of the ANZ. In most cases, if not all, patron presents the funds to the money changer or overseas staff in one amount, and then the overseas money changer splits up the funds to deposit cash in Crown Perth's account in amounts under $10,000.
Yeah.
That was something that you said to Ms van der Klauw at the time, wasn't it?
Well, again, it says that I did. I don't remember having the conversation, but it states I did, so I won't dispute that it says that that's what I did, yes.
Well, Mr Brown, it's a conversation I suggest that you clearly would remember if you had it.
I have a lot of conversations with a lot of people about a lot of things. I don't remember every conversation I had back in 2013 and 2014.
I'm not suggesting that you remember every conversation you had between 2013 and 2015, Mr Brown. I'm suggesting that you must remember a conversation with Ms van der Klauw where you explained to her your understanding of ANZ's concerns about structuring on the ANZ bank accounts.
And I'm sorry, I don't remember having that conversation. I'm not saying it says there I did. I'm not saying I didn't have it. I don't remember that.
Well, Ms van der Klauw has given evidence to this Royal Commission that you did have that conversation with her in terms of the email that she sent to Mr Preston. You don't dispute that?
If she, as I said there, if she's stated in it that we had the conversation, and she's put it in her evidence, then I'm not disputing what she's saying. I just don't remember having the conversation.
Now, for an example of what Ms van der Klauw is talking about in this email, can we go not on the public screen, please, to CRW.707.031.0286. This is the paperwork for a TT. You'll see the date there, August 2013, for a deposit of $165,563. Can I just ask you on the way through, down the bottom, there is the reference in comments, redemption/safekeeping.
Yep.
What's the safekeeping reference to?
In 2013, if I remember correctly, the patron would have sent this money in to redeem an outstanding amount that he or she would have owed Crown Perth. But if it wasn't sufficient funds to redeem the full amount that they owed, it may be placed in a safekeeping offset account under their name until sufficient funds came in to redeem the line in full.
Why wouldn't it be just partially redeemed at that point?
Because to do a partial redemption of a credit marker, or in those days, required a new marker to be signed. And if the patron's not there to sign it, because a new marker for the reduced value would replace the value of the initial marker. So we would then have an unsigned marker, which would be no value to us. So funds were placed in safekeeping, which were used as an offset until sufficient funds were received to redeem the full outstanding line.
So also on the way through, can I just point you to the patron's signature row, third of the way up?
Yep.
And that says NA to sign.
Yep.
So do I understand correctly, the patron hasn't signed for funds?
Correct.
And is that because it's a redemption arrangement?
Yep, because they've sent it in. So our terms and conditions under a patron deposit account is that we can apply funds to their account to redeem outstanding if they've been sent in. So in that regard, it is permissible to not available to sign if they're sending funds in to redeem an outstanding line.
Now if we go to page 0287, this is the bank deposit slip in relation to this aggregate amount of $165,563.
Yep.
And we see multiple deposits close to but under the threshold for mandatory reporting, and we can see that they're at all different branches of the ANZ.
Correct.
That immediately raises a suspicion in your mind, doesn't it?
Oh, looking at that, yes.
Well, it's obvious, isn't it?
I think it looks obvious, yes.
Yes. And if we go to 0289 and following, we've got the receipts that reflect what we've just seen in the bank statement.
Yes.
Different branches at which these deposits have been made. Did you understand at the time, that is 2013, that activity, as is evidenced in the paperwork for this transaction, was occurring regularly on the Riverbank account?
No.
And I suggest to you that you did, which is why you explained to Ms van der Klauw that you understood the concerns of the ANZ Bank at this time regarding the structuring of cash deposits through its accounts.
I don't think you've used the term regularly. I wasn't viewing the accounts. I'm not regularly viewing the accounts and regularly seeing how many transactions. So was I aware, as we pointed out, Denise has given her evidence, and Ms van der Klauw has given her evidence that we had the conversation. You've said regularly occurring. I'm not sure of whether it was regularly occurring or whether it was occurring as a one-off or a more than one-off, or whether it was daily or weekly or monthly, or what was considered to be regular.
Well, you certainly knew at the time that it was more than a one-off, didn't you?
I really can't remember what I knew at the time. So.
Let's go back to Ms van der Klauw's schedule of deposits for 2013. That's not on the public screen, CRL.725.001.0155, please. Starting in July 2013, you can just page through. All of this looks suspicious to you, doesn't it?
Yeah, I would look at that now and think that they look suspicious.
And that's what you knew was happening on the account, which is why ANZ expressed concerns about how the account was being operated.
I don't know if I knew of all the transactions that were occurring on the account. I don't remember ever having seen a list like this or going through a list like this of the transactions occurring in the account.
Coming back to the transaction that I just showed you the paperwork for at page 0155. Down the bottom there, 20 August 2013, you see that?
Oh, that one, I couldn't see the date, sorry. Yep.
No SMR. See that?
Yep.
Patently a suspicious transaction. Mr. Brown, you accept that?
It certainly looks to be a suspicious transaction, yes.
Yeah. And a failure of the cage operations to have not determined and actioned it as such.
I would think it should have been reported as a suspect matter, yes.
Yeah. And then if we come back to the document as a whole, the schedule, so pop that back in, please. So of the 4 transactions on the first page, only one, sorry, I'll withdraw that. On the first page, 3 transactions not the subject of SMRs. See that?
Yeah.
Next page. 2 transactions not the subject of SMRs. Next page. None of those the subject of SMRs. Next.
I'd have to say though, just in supporting that, you've got one on there which is the third bottom one, which lists a $6,000 deposit and a $4,000 deposit could not always be determined that one transaction would make up an SMR. I appreciate some of the other ones, but there are some that if they come in, depending on what they are, without looking at all the documentation, they may not always trigger an SMR because they were different types of deposits. They might have been processed by the bank in a different way.
Okay, so let's go back to the front page then, 155. Which of those do you say are obviously, not obviously SMRs?
Well, potentially, without viewing, without knowing, the first 2 are possibly different.
The last one,
Possibly.
obviously.
The last one, looking at it, as we look at it now, clearly looks, you know, with all those transactions around the branches of Sydney, as I know them to be now, clearly would be considered to be suspicious, yes.
Well, not obviously now, Mr. Brown. Obviously then, and irrespective of whether they were cash deposits in different branches, just the method of depositing is very suspicious, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Over the page, please, 156. Transaction in the middle of the page.
Well, that clearly looks suspicious, yes.
Right. Next page. You see that last one was, we'll go back 156. So you've got 2 deposits there, and then over the page, third one, that's suspicious, isn't it?
That would look suspicious, yes.
And all of them bar the one for the 5th of September that you pointed out to me on 0157, yes. Highly suspicious.
Suspicious, yes.
Next page, please. Because that might be the end of it. No? So the middle transaction, that's suspicious, isn't it?
It would look, again, it would look to be multiple transactions under the threshold, yes.
So the cage is missing a lot of suspicious transactions, isn't it?
It would appear to be, yes.
Yeah, and that's a failure of the cage operation.
It would appear so, yes.
Coming back to Ms van der Klauw's email, please, not on the public screen, crw.529.001.9090. If we blow up that second paragraph, please, or that's fine as it is. I won't read it out again, that second sentence where it says in most cases. Explains how it's done. You don't dispute that you were the source of the information in that second sentence?
I'm not I can't confirm that it was me, but if Denise has said it's me, then I'm not in a position to, if I can't remember it and she can, then I have to accept that that's her opinion. Yeah.
Well, Mr Brown, what this second sentence suggests is that you've actually made some inquiries about how it gets to the point that these under $10,000 multiple cash deposits are being made into different, into the bank account through different branches of the ANZ, insofar as the patron presents the funds to the money changer in one amount overseas, and then it's split up by the money changer or overseas staff. So did you make inquiries about how these deposits were being made to the ANZ account?
No, I didn't make inquiries.
Are you sure about that?
I'm not, I don't remember making any inquiries into how the monies were made in the ANZ. I remember this transaction, so I don't remember that. I wouldn't have made inquiries. No.
So if Ms van der Klauw is correct that the source of the information in this second sentence was you, it's possible, isn't it, that you had made some inquiries in order to ascertain that information?
I don't remember making inquiries with the ANZ. No.
So I'm not sure I asked you about whether you'd made inquiries with the ANZ. Did you make inquiries generally?
I don't remember making inquiries, no.
You could have though, couldn't you?
I could have. I have had access to information, but I don't remember making.
And I suggest to you that if you had made those inquiries, it's certainly something that you would have remembered and remember now.
Yeah, if I'd made those inquiries, I think I would remember it, yes.
So you're saying you didn't make those inquiries?
I don't remember making those inquiries, is what I'm saying, yes.
The reason why you would remember if you'd made those inquiries is this, isn't it? That second sentence creates an obvious suspicion in the mind of the person who learns of it that there's cuckoo smurfing going on.
I think that, it doesn't look good. It doesn't, as we said, it should have been raised as suspicious matter reporting based on the information that we've got there, yes.
In March 2014, when ANZ expressed its concerns about the operation of the Riverbank account, did you check the Cage's TA file to see whether suspicious matter reports had been raised with respect to transactions that involved multiple cash deposits to different branches of the ANZ Bank?
I don't believe I would have, because the suspicious matter file, there wouldn't have been suspicious matters attached to the transactions. So did I check it? No, I don't believe so, no.
Did you take any steps at that point to ensure that the Cage staff were alert to reporting suspicious matters in respect of possible structuring, such as were evidenced in the transaction I just took you to?
I don't remember, and I'm not sure.
Did you take any steps at this point to consider whether the SOPs and casino manual in respect of cage operations adequately addressed the risk of structuring of deposits to casino bank accounts to avoid the mandatory AUSTRAC threshold reporting requirements?
No, I don't remember making changes to the SOP at that time.
Did you alert Mr McGregor as CFO to the issue of what was happening on the ANZ bank accounts in terms of multiple cash deposits under the threshold occurring at different branches?
As I said at the time, I'm not sure was Mr McGregor CFO at that time, or was it Mr Spence? I'm not sure.
Yes, I'll just check that, thank you. But you didn't, well, did you raise it with Mr Spence?
Mr Spence, according to the previous email, was involved in the conversation I had with Mr McGreevy if that happened. So Mr Spence, from that point of view, must have been aware in the same regard as what I was, if that's what Mr McGreevy is saying. So, but I'm not sure back at that time whether Mr Spence and Mr McGregor were CFO. I know Mr Spence was for a period of time, but I'm not sure of the exact time frame.
Did you alert Mr Bossy or Mr Felsted to the issue?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm not sure whether Mr Preston would have done so.
Whether Mr Preston would have done so?
Well, he was involved in that discussion with Mr McGreevy if there was a concern.
Did you take any steps at the time to prevent deposits such as the ones in the transaction I've just identified being made to Perth Casino's bank accounts?
I'm not aware if I did know.
Do you remember attending a meeting with ANZ with a number of other members of Crown Perth in late March?
I don't have a recollection of attending a meeting with ANZ, no.
Really, Mr Brown?
Yes, I really don't have a recollection of attending a meeting with the ANZ.
Commissioner, it's just a couple of minutes before 1 and I'm about to start on another document.
Right. Mr Brown, we break for an hour now, so we'll come back at 2 p.m. our time, which is 4 p.m. your time.
No problem. Thank you.
2 p.m.